Today's story is one of the interesting stories that talks about a person who survived at sea after 438 days. This story is full of events, suspense, and adventure. Let's dive into it and its details. Alvarenga was an experienced fisherman in Mexico on November 17, 2012. He and another guy named Ezequiel Cordoba departed together on their small fishing boat from the tiny fishing village of Costa Azul on the Mexican Pacific coast. They planned to only work for a 30-hour fishing shift, so their boat was pretty small and not at all equipped for the nightmare. It was basically a canoe with no roof. Our cabin was only 7 meters long and only had one small motor and a refrigerator for storing their fish. They knew that a storm was coming near the area, but fishermen in these parts of Mexico can earn enough money in a day to support themselves for an entire week. So they decided to take their chances and traveled 120 kilometers away from the coast to work at 1 a.m. The storm hit them and was threatening to sink their boats. In a panic, that the two men cut their fishing lines and dropped everything. They catch most of their gear overboard to make themselves more maneuverable. They were 6 hours away from the coast. So they traveled through the storm and the night in a desperate attempt to get back by 7 a.m. They were only 24 kilometers away from the coast and could see mountains on the horizon, but then awful luck struck the man. Their motor died. Without any paddles or sails, the unusually strong wind began pushing their boat back out towards the ocean. Their onboard radio still thankfully worked, so they frantically reported their position to their boss, who responded saying that he was coming, but their battery died, and all they heard afterwards was imagine the frustration that they must have both felt in that moment as their radio died and all contact with the outside world with it, and as they watched the mountains in the horizon that they were so close to slowly disappear as their boat that they were trapped on gradually was pushed back out into the vast abyss. Their boss did organize a search party to look for them for days, but as their boat drifted further out into the vastness of the Pacific, it got harder and harder. So they eventually were forced to give up just 5 days later. The wind had already blown them 450 kilometers off the coast before finally settling down. They were surrounded by nothing but ocean in every direction, and their boat was so small. They knew that they probably would never be spotted from the air. They had no flare gun or any other way to signal for help other than by waving, so they knew that their chances of survival were going to be slim. They had no supplies left on board, so they were forced to catch tiny fish or birds that landed on their boat with their bare hands for food. They grabbed plastic bottles that they found floating nearby them and used them to collect rainwater for drinking water. But during long periods of no rain, they were forced to mostly drink the blood of turtles that they caught with their hands or their own urine. Imagine going day after day, month after month, in a tiny box with only one other person to talk to, and the only other ways to entertain yourselves being catching fish or napping. It's easy to understand how somebody could go insane under these conditions, which according to Alvarenga's story, his friend. Did the other guy, Cordoba, gave up hope about 4 months into their isolation and became suicidal. He got sick from all of the raw food that they were eating and refused to eat, and eventually starved to death. Alvarenga was then all alone in the middle of nowhere with another human in sight. As far as the horizon could see, a tiny speck inside of the enormous Pacific. And as you can see from this shipping map, the Central Pacific, where he was somewhere at, is a very quiet part of the world. Ships rarely come through this area. But even still, he claims to have encountered one when he was alone. A cargo ship apparently passed right by him, and 4 men on board spotted him and waved, but they just kept moving past him and never even bothered to stop. Imagine how frustrated he would have been again. If you were lost for months, You were all alone, and you finally spotted rescue. But they just ignored you and kept on moving 11 months in, and Alvarenga had traveled about 8,000 kilometers across the ocean in his tiny little boat. His clothes were shredded, and he only had his wet shirt to protect himself against the sun, but finally on the 30th of January 2014, he spotted coconuts bobbing around his boat and birds landing around him. He knew that land was near, and after drifting some more he discovered an island that appeared to be uninhabited. It took him half a day just to drift near the shore when he finally jumped out of his boat and left its safety for the first time in over a year. He swam ashore and discovered a house, and when he knocked, he made contact with the first other humans since he left his village in Mexico 430 days ago, and after traveling nearly 11,000 kilometers. To put into perspective just how far away that is, imagine starting in a tinny boat in Lisbon, Portugal, and traveling less than 1 mile per hour until you drifted across the land to Hiroshima, Japan. Alvarenga ended up washing ashore on the Ibana Atoll, which is the southern tip of the Marshall Islands and one of the most remote spots on the planet. Had he missed this spot, the next likely stop for him would have been the Philippines, nearly 5,000 more kilometers away. And since it took him 438 days to travel roughly 11,000 kilometers, it probably would have taken him about 240 more days to hit the Philippines. Fortunately for him, though, he somehow landed on this tiny speck in the middle of the biggest ocean on Earth and got himself rescued because of it later. He was flown back to his home in El Salvador, where he published a book and got himself sued by the family of his friend who died on the boat because they claimed that he probably ate him. So the lesson is, even if you survive more than a year stranded at sea, you could still end up getting sued over something that you may or may not have actually done while you were out there.